All right. It is a real pleasure and sincere honor, given the last 24 hours, 48 hours of events, to be joined by two incredibly important journalists, Max Blumenthal of The Gray Zone, Sam Husseini, an independent journalist, both of whom made news by speaking truth to power at Blinken's last press conference at the end of last week. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
Good to be with you.
The
All
honor is
right.
all mine.
No, really, honestly, it's such a weird time. We're recording this a day before inauguration, and we've spent years hearing about the threat of fascism under Donald Trump. Uh, you know, years literally litigating and watching videos of January 6th, watching an entire Democratic Party try to use that day and the imagery of that day to generate energy around a resistance movement. And whatever you think of those kinds of choices, to be confronted in the final days of the Biden administration with imagery that I find to be similarly galling, if not more, because of the focus on the press, which is you both being ejected from this final press conference, and Sam, you being forcibly removed, manhandled, yanked out of the room while asking some of the most pointed and important questions that are before our country today, really, I think, speaks to the complete and total absence of genuine democratic options before the people of the United States. And it's so important to me to hear from you both about how you're feeling going into the Trump era, about the freedom of the press, and specifically, obviously, how you feel about these ceasefire negotiations that have come into effect as we're recording officially today. I want to start with you, Sam. Set the stage for us a little bit about how the events at that press conference started to go down.
I'm happy to do that, and I'm looking forward to getting into the substantive questions that you laid out there. Um, I mean, in the immediate, um, you know, at the news conference, so-called news conference, it was really a speech in large part. Blinken was given a speech, and then Max chimed in and very poignantly made his comments and a series of questions, and got escorted out. I was taking a different approach in terms of trying to ask tough questions at timely moments as he was speaking. I did that. I've done that in the past and haven't gotten hauled out. Um, and I think that they made a determination that they didn't want a chance Blinken having to answer any of my questions if he couldn't maintain the mental focus to ignore me, as Miller has in the past. I mean, I did something similar with Elliot Abrams when they brought him into the Trump administration, and he was able to ignore my questions. Blinken apparently couldn't do that, so they decided that the visual of having a bunch of so-called security people drag me out of the chair was better for them than, chancing Blinken having to answer about why they don't recognize the Geneva Conventions, what the Hannibal Doctrine is, what about Israel's nuclear weapons, how they sabotaged the ICJ orders with this phony ceasefire process.
And I want to thank my colleagues, in particular, Jake Sullivan, Bill Burns, Brett McGurk, for their remarkable skill, tireless dedication over these many months of negotiation.
Will you recognize the Geneva Conventions apply to the Palestinians?
And again, I'm happy to address questions when we have a chance. I'm happy to address questions in a moment. Thank you. As we celebrate the return of hostages in Gaza, including Americans, as we look to relief for the people of Gaza, I'm also thinking of all those U.S. citizens who are held wrongfully, who are hostage in countries around the world,
Do you know about the
I
Hannibal
carry with me-
Directive? Miller says he doesn't know about the Hannibal Directive. Do you know about the Hannibal Directive?
Again, I'm happy to address questions.
No, I want him
Just
to
a
answer
few-
my
just a few
questions.
minutes. I look forward to answering
He's going to
questions.
speak for an
Thank you.
hour.
Okay, well, we'll let him speak. We're here for him. Thank you.
He
Thank you.
gets to make lots of speeches.
Thank you.
Let him answer some questions. Let him answer some questions instead of making another speech every
Sir,
day.
would you like to be escorted out?
Go away.
You don't have the responsibility to tell me where to go. Do you want to be escorted out or not?
I want him to
Thank you.
answer
Okay,
questions.
then let's be quiet.
I'm
I
a
look forward to
journalist.
answering questions in a minute.
I'm a
Thank
journalist.
you.
I'm not a potted plant.
Everyone will have an opportunity to ask questions in just a minute. Thank you.
Miller
So-
has explicitly told me he will not answer my questions. I'm justified in
So-
what I'm doing.
I have no greater pleasure in this job than crossing off a list I carry in my pocket,
You don't want to
the
end up
names
on
of
the
those
website.
who have been arbitrarily detained
live with yourself.
and unjustly held hostage, and bringing them home, returning them to their families, returning them to their loved ones. Finally, I
Get
just
your
wanted
hands
to share
off
this
me.
morning.
Get your hands off me. Get your hands off me. Get your hands off me. Answer a damn question.
I look
Do you know
forward to
about the
answering
Hannibal
questions in a few
Directive?
minutes.
Do you know about Israel's nuclear weapons? Everybody from the ICJ. I was sitting here quietly, and now I'm being manhandled by 2 or 3 people. You pontificate about a free press. You pontificate about a free press. You are hurting me. You are hurting me. You are hurting me. I am asking questions after being told by Matt Miller that he will not answer my questions until I'm asking
Please,
questions.
sir, respect the process. We'll have an opportunity to take
Wasn't
questions
the
in a few
IC,
minutes.
wasn't the point of the May 31st statement to block the ICJ orders? You blocked the ICJ orders. You
Please, sir, respect the process. Thank you.
oh, respect the process. Respect the process. Well, everybody from Amnesty International, to the ICJ, saying that Israel's doing genocide and extermination, and you're telling me to respect the process. Criminal, why aren't you in the Hague? Why aren't you in the Hague? Why aren't you in the Hague?
After the video, and people have probably seen of me getting carried out of there, they roughed me up pretty good, went through my pockets as if I posed a danger, handcuffed me quite roughly, walked me out of the building the very long way around, rattling my shoulder throughout. My shoulder still hurts. My arm falls asleep. I'm on muscle relaxants to be able to sleep. The more general context was, Max and I didn't know if they were going to have a news conference, a closing news conference. They put out the notice, the public notice, like an hour before, because independent journalists like Max and I, we don't have offices at the State Department, unlike the big corporate places. So it required a lot of vigilance from both of us to be able to get there in time to participate. And I've been, the general context for me is, Miller has totally shut me out. They spent years ignoring, or minimizing how much they engage with me, as well as Max. I remember past news conferences with me, Max, and Liam Cosgrove. And at the end of the news conference, it's just the 3 of us with our hands up, and they wouldn't call, they called on everybody else except the 3 of us. Stuff like that regularly happened. They have this huge apparatus to try to ignore and marginalize us. Other reporters, if they say, follow up on a given question, they'll generally get respected. I was never afforded that same respect. And then they would, oftentimes on the rare occasions when they do call on somebody like Max and me, they'll very quickly go to another favorite journalist to use that as a way of cutting us off. Like when I asked about the Hannibal Directive, Miller claimed he didn't know about it and immediately went to a wire service reporter who brought up another subject, and that was it. And that was it.
And is there ever, follow up with some of those other reporters? Is there any sense of solidarity in the room? Like, hey, next time, don't let yourself be used in this way. It benefits them to get the answer to the more provocative question, I would think, on the record. Or are they more concerned about maintaining access and maintaining their status as someone who is going to be guaranteed to get called on in that briefing than actually having a, solidaristic I am Spartacus moment with you and Max and other more adversarial journalists?
Yeah, I think that there's a huge part of it is access. There have been occasions when other reporters have, for example, my Geneva Convention thing, Matt Lee picked up on that in the press room once or twice. Liam Cosgrove once got Blinken in the hallway to ask that. The U.S. policy is that they do not recognize the Geneva Conventions as applying to the Palestinians. It's completely insane, but they will not say it because it is such a ridiculous thing to say. I mean, they're not only sabotaging the Genocide Convention that South Africa brought forth, even the Geneva Convention, the bedrock of international law. And that they'll totally, evade the question. Or Miller once told me, of course we recognize the Geneva Conventions, and then quickly went to another question. He didn't say we recognize the Geneva Conventions as applying to the Palestinians. And I later confronted him one-on-one on that, and it was obvious that that was an intentional, massive deceit on his part. So Liam Cosgrove once got Blinken in the hallway and asked him, do you recognize the Geneva Conventions? And Blinken says, is this on the record? And Blinken,
I remember that.
yeah. And Liam says, yeah, it's on the record. And he was like, no, I can't do it. And walked away.
That's incredible.
And so when I raised, the Geneva Conventions with Blinken as one of the questions, he responds, I'm happy to take questions at the end. Now, I've already been told by Miller he's not going to take my questions. And I know that he wouldn't answer the question when Liam posed it to him in the hallway. It's such a complete farce where they pretend to have this facade of openness and democracy, where in fact they're kneecapping it at every level.
So, Max, is that reality, the sort of obfuscation that Sam has been encountering and in fact did encounter at this briefing that we're talking about, why you took a somewhat different approach? Walk me through your strategic choice of how you approach this final tete-a-tete, face-to-face with Blinken.
Well, I'd been replaying in my mind how I would confront or challenge or question Tony Blinken if I ever got in the room with him. And I knew that I wasn't going to be called on. I knew because I went to the briefing the day before, Matt Miller's final briefing. And it was so agonizing to not interrupt when he would not call on me for the, after countless times of refusing to call on me. He basically boycotted me after Sam and I trapped him on like October 12th, 2023, when Israel had begun, or it was October 15th, had begun destroying the north of Gaza and Gaza City, like just fully destroying the city. And the Israeli leaders had issued direct, explicit calls for genocide. And I challenged him on that. And Sam chimed in, and it infuriated Miller, who thought that only Israel was the victim, only Israeli trauma should be recognized. And he started shouting at us and lecturing us with this stern finger-wagging lecture about the suffering of Jewish Israelis.
Go ahead.
Yeah, in March, you condemned Israel's finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, for calling for wiping the Palestinian village of Huwara off the map. This week, we've heard the defense minister of Israel, Yoav Gallant, declare that he's fighting human animals in Gaza as Israel cuts off the gas, the water, and the electricity. We've heard Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, declare that all hiding places will be turned to rubble in a besieged coastal enclave where there are 1 million children. We've heard Ariel Kalner, who is a member of Knesset from the ruling Likud party, call for a Nakba 2.0, which is essentially a call for genocide and the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians as 850 are dead in Gaza. So what do you think of that rhetoric in light of your previous condemnation?
Let me say a few things about that. Number one, we expect, as we said, that Israel will conduct its operations in accordance with international law. Number two, there are going to be a number of statements made over the course of this conflict, and when we have disagreements with them, we will make those known privately. Number three, though, let me just speak to this. Number three, some of the questions I'm getting today do seem to ignore the fact that Israel just had hundreds of its citizens killed, people who were taken hostage, and pretend that Israel shouldn't be able to conduct any kind of. Let me just say, because
Palestinian children have been killed? Do you acknowledge that? Will you even acknowledge that?
Let me finish.
80 Palestinian children killed
you know
this
what?
week?
Again,
Babies? Do you acknowledge that?
You asked a question. I will answer the question.
Okay, that's my question.
So I'm going to start by answering the previous question that was interrupted. I will say some of the questions seem to pretend that Israel should not be able to conduct operations to defend itself and hold accountable the terrorists who killed civilians. That is not Israel's policy. That is not our policy. It is something that we would vehemently disagree with. Israel has the right to secure its country the way any country does. It has the right to defend itself against terrorism. It has the right to hold terrorists accountable. And I will say, ultimately, the Hamas terrorists who launched these operations, there is no one who has more disregard for Palestinian civilian life than those terrorists. Because those terrorists, let me finish. Those terrorists launched this activity. Those terrorists, again, we seem to have a lot of new people. Those terrorists launched this activity knowing that there would be retaliation, knowing that Israel would have to defend itself as any country did, knowing that it would lead to the unfortunate loss of civilian lives by Palestinians, and they did anyway. Let me go ahead.
That's amazing.
So baby killing is okay here.
Why can't you acknowledge
Baby killing is okay here.
You can't even acknowledge
We always mourn the loss of civilian life. It is an unfortunate circumstance every time it happens. And as I just said, the Hamas terrorists who launched this terrorist attack, knowing that it would produce the loss of not just direct Israeli lives, who they took in their incursions across the border, but also the loss of Palestinian civilian life, they ultimately bear the responsibility for those acts. Go ahead. Go ahead. Go. I'm gonna ask. I just did do that. I would ask you not to talk over your colleague. Go ahead.
Matt, thank you. Is there a latest U.S. assessment
I just did.
on Saudi's
Go ahead.
the potential normalization deal with Israel? And
Go ahead. There was a little talking over you. Why don't you go ahead and go again?
And I think it really exposed the administration's whole approach going forward. And from that point on, he would never call on me again. I managed to get in some questions with Vedant Patel, and I did it by kind of just like muscling my way in, just because, and Vedant did seem to be a little bit more open to the dissenters in the room, but he was rarely there. So there was, the day before Blinken came, we didn't know if Tony Blinken was coming the following day. The ceasefire had just been announced. Biden wanted to take credit for it. And I sat through the agonizing Miller briefing where he actually explicitly celebrated, he said, Hamas's ally in Syria being wiped off the map. Basically like Syria being wiped off the map. And said in very candid terms that the ceasefire couldn't take place because Israel was doing so much damage to perceived U.S. enemies in the region that they just wanted to let that play out. And it is just like, and he called it like a bipartisan effort. And it just there were so many points where I wanted to interject, but I behaved because I thought Blinken would be coming the next day. I did a TikTok with Ryan Grimm actually in the press room where he said, what are you going to ask, Max? And I said, well, the chances of me being called on are between 0 and -1 million. So it was really for me about using the opportunity of being in that room. And I'll address the culture in the room a little bit more in a second or explain it. It was using that opportunity to channel the indignation and righteous rage of billions of people around the world at Tony Blinken, who really was singularly identified with the policy of extermination in Gaza.
300 reporters in Gaza were on the receiving end of your bombs. Why did you keep the bombs flowing when we had a deal in May? We all knew we had a deal. Everyone in this room knows we had a deal, Tony, and you kept the bombs flowing. Why did you sacrifice the rules-based order on the mantle of your commitment to Zionism? Why did you allow my friends to be massacred? Why did you allow my friends' homes in Gaza to be destroyed when we had a deal in May? You helped destroy our religion, Judaism, by associating it with fascism. You waved the white flag before
We'll
Netanyahu.
have the time to take questions at the end.
You waved the white flag before Israeli fascism.
We'll have the time to take questions
Your
at the end.
father-in-law was an Israel lobbyist. Your grandfather was an Israel lobbyist. Are you compromised by Israel? Why did you allow the Holocaust of our time to happen? How does it feel to have your legacy be genocide? How does it feel to have your legacy be genocide? You too, Matt. You smirked through the whole thing every day. You smirked through a genocide.
Thank you.
I can't think of any Secretary of State in my lifetime who was more identified with and responsible for such a titanic crime, really like the crime of the century. Even Condoleezza Rice, I don't even think she meets that mark. And it was thanks to so many of the courageous activists who were camped out outside Blinken's home that a lot of people were educated about his role, which he constantly tried to conceal. Others tried to conceal by claiming Kamala and the Biden team were working tirelessly for a ceasefire. Blinken constantly talked about how he was pressuring Israel. He portrayed himself as this dour diplomat who enjoyed playing, like ripping off Muddy Waters songs. Everything he did belied the reality of what was taking place inside the rooms where the decisions were made. And it was the rooms where the decisions were made included the 9-story underground bunker underneath Israel's Hakiria, where Blinken met with the Israeli military intelligence leadership on October 12th after announcing that he had come to Israel as a Jew, not as a diplomat, to help them orchestrate this genocide. And he never applied any leverage to even force humanitarian aid in, which was one of his stated objectives. So many people around the world I knew were just so outraged with this figure. And the culture in that briefing room, as Sam will tell you, is sycophantic. They're courting favor with Matt Miller and Tony Blinken. Blinken comes out in the briefing and thanks all the reporters for being his friends. And he said, well, I know this could get you in a little bit of trouble, but we're all friends. And, he goes out to dinner with them at Jose Andres restaurants. Jose Andres is one of his friends. And this is a guy who basically lost his staff to Tony Blinken when Israel murdered like 7 World Central Kitchen workers, staffers who were courageously trying to get food to people in Gaza. They were targeted and killed in a double, triple tap strike. And Jose Andres continues to foster this relationship and accepts a Medal of Freedom from Joe Biden. That's the mentality and psyche that defines a lot of the people in the State Department briefing room as well. And they would hang out with Blinken at his house for sure. I heard from one reporter, and I'm sure it's true, that Matt Miller went to drinks with several of the reporters after his final briefing. So no one was going to do this. They weren't going to ask the hard questions of Blinken. Blinken was taking a victory lap, and I wasn't going to let it happen. I was not going to allow him to walk out of that room with his legacy intact in the way that he wanted it consolidated when he really truly was the Secretary of Genocide. And so after I heard him just talk about how how friendly he was with these reporters, I got up and began to I began what I consider to be a humanitarian intervention, but also a journalistic I think a legitimate journalistic activity, which is to ask him a lot of the hard questions that other reporters would not ask. And some of those questions did focus on Blinken's Judaism and his Zionism. And I wanted to distinguish myself from him as a Jew to show that there is a civil war within Judaism, because I believe Blinken is responsible for a rise in anti-Semitism by embodying anti-Semitic stereotypes. By siding with a foreign apartheid power that is a Jewish state as a Jew within the United States government, and betraying the Constitution and the people of the United States for a foreign power. That to me fuels anti-Semitism. And I think people around the world needed to see that there is no Jewish consensus with Tony Blinken's activities. He also is a liberal Zionist who comes from a context in Washington, D.C. that I, partly was raised in. And I actually knew, I knew growing up, people very close to Tony Blinken. I also, know people who stepped out of the State Department who were on Matt Miller's comms team as whistleblowers. And so this was personal for me. And I asked him about his grandfather, who played a seminal role in the foundation of Israel, Maurice Blinken, who produced a study on the feasibility of colonizing Palestine and bringing in as many Jews as possible from around the world, which would force the ethnic cleansing of indigenous Palestinians after the British colonial authorities introduced their white paper on limiting Jewish emigration to historic Palestine, Mandate Palestine. And I brought up Blinken's father-in-law, Samuel Pisar, who was also an Israel lobbyist, was kind of the Jewish consigliere to Francois Mitterrand. He was the fixer for Robert Maxwell, who was a Mossad agent. Last person Robert Maxwell called before he mysteriously fell off his yacht was Samuel Pisar. And Blinken himself has said to AIPAC and at other meetings that his commitment to Israel's strength comes through his family and their legacy. So this isn't something Blinken was hiding, but it was something the press was hiding, and it should have been an issue. How can someone rise to the position of top diplomat when they are so compromised by their commitment to a genocidal foreign power that has been ethnically cleansing and occupying people for 76 years? It should have been an issue. In Washington, it made him an asset. And so I put that out on there, that on the table, along with his genocidal legacy. And as I was being pushed out of the room, Matt Miller shows up. I'm like, this is perfect. You want some too? Like, I've wanted to confront you for so long, for 15 months, and here you are. So I just, said, you smirked through a genocide. Like, how do you feel about that? His attitude was so condescending, not just to reporters like Sam, but Prem Thakur from The Intercept. I remember he said to him, I know, Prem, that you just wanted us to cut off support to Israel. That's what you want. And we're not going to do that.
Our colleagues at Politico reported that a U.S. envoy told aid groups that the U.S. would not consider withholding weapons to Israel for blocking food and medicine, that essentially the rules don't apply to Israel. Given
it's not essential. No, forget what the essentially. That's not at all an accurate representation of her comments.
That's not
all of which were accurately presented in that article. I would say, should note, as always with these, you have what becomes a secondhand presentation put into an article. Not all of those comments were in any way accurate.
Sure, but was the basic characterization of her describing U.S.
I'm not going to speak to a private meeting, but we have always made clear that we are committed to the defense of Israel. We will continue to support the defense of Israel, but we also are going to enforce U.S. law.
So you will enforce U.S. law, including
if you look at the letter that the secretary sent the other day, he said that there are a number of U.S. laws and policies that are implemented by Israel not taking steps to allow humanitarian assistance to get in, and we will enforce U.S. law. But we're going we want to see Israel take increased steps. We've seen them take some increased steps over the last few days, but we need to see much more.
I guess there have been previous instances for which this threat has been sort of floated, whether it's in the wake of this 7 Central Kitchen workers that were killed, whether it was in before any sort of major operation in Rafah. Of course, the administration maintains that there wasn't a major operation, but nevertheless, there have been instances for which this threat has been offered, and yet there hasn't been any actualization of it.
So I know that your objective is to see the end of U.S. support to Israel. Our objective is to see Israel take steps to increase humanitarian assistance getting into Gaza. We have other steps as well, but that's relevant to the conversation we're having now. And so our engagement with them on this question has been to push them to take steps. And at times we've seen them take really important steps. When we had this last major engagement with them in April, we saw them take a number of steps to open new crossings, and it got trucks up to 300 to 400 in some days. Now we saw significant first stagnation and then backsliding over the last few months, which is why the secretary felt it was important to send that letter this Sunday.
To be clear,
Sean,
my objective is not to. My objective is to ask about the U.S. enforcement.
I understand,
laws.
Sean.
So it was, in a way, it was personally satisfying or personally cathartic for me to be able to confront him, but it wasn't really about me. People can say anything they want about me or my politics. It was about channeling the outrage of billions of people around the world with this policy that Blinken embodied. And, since that interruption, humanitarian intervention, legitimate and what I consider to be a legitimate journalistic activity, I've heard from like everyone from friends that I haven't heard from in years to the president of Colombia, Gustavo Petro, praising me for what I did. And it really just speaks to the sheer anger and disgust with people around the world with this policy. And I think the US has set itself on a disastrous course.
The outpouring has been incredible online and in person. I got a call from Jesse Jackson right after it. The doctor that I went to at the urgent care clinic, I'd never been there before. I'd never seen him before. I'm describing to him why I'm sitting in his office. And he's like, "You're that guy." And he pulls down his mask and, shakes my hand. So, the outpouring of support there has been tremendous. Can I share a story, a little insider story of when Max and I think it was the first time that Max came to the briefing room in October of 2023. He came and he sat next to me, and I was like, I don't think you should, I was like glad to see him, saying, great to see you, Max. But I don't think you should sit next to me because if you're associated with me, he might avoid you. And then we chatted a little more. And then Max told me that he didn't think that Miller knew what he looked like. Now, one of the ways that Miller was trying to taunt me was by constantly calling on people to my left, to my right, in front of me, behind me, while I'm, sitting there with my hand up, and I'm occasionally interjecting when somebody says, something. I say, follow up, and I even start asking a question sometimes, and once in a while I can muscle my way in, but usually I can't. So I was like, no, you sit right there, Max. You sit right next to me. And sure enough, Miller fell into the trap, and he called on Max. And I don't think the camera quite captured it, but there in person, you could see his face melt a little bit as Max started his question and laying it to him. And he's like, damn, they got me.
And then Sam said, like, I forget what it was, but it was a response to Miller. And you were like, is baby killing legitimate? Is killing babies legitimate? And that became the headline of, I think, the first really damaging viral video for them. In Forbes headlined it, "Is baby killing legitimate?" And this was early on. Even members of the alternative press, the independent press, were afraid to really challenge them directly because of the shock of October 7th. So I think it was a turning point.
Yeah.
This just really underscores just how critical a role the press plays and how asleep at the job most of them have been, and how I don't want to, I'm not trying to seem cringe or, overly saccharine here, but like genuinely heroic what you two have been doing, not just at this last briefing, but over the course of the last almost year and a half now. I cannot say enough how important your reporting has been to people like me who are more in a commentary capacity, constantly reading your reporting from the Gray Zone, Max, reading, the stuff from Electric Intifada, like reading all of the independent journalism was so fortifying when you're out at the front of a news organization and you know that it's your responsibility to make these arguments against incredible headwinds, and to have people doing real reporting and kind of being that first vanguard and taking the slings and arrows of those attacks. I really cannot emphasize enough how impossible being in this space would have been without the two of you and people like you. So I just want to reiterate that and thank you again.
Thank you.
I want to ask.
We got called cringeworthy by CNN. So
as you heard, he was repeatedly interrupted by some cringeworthy heckling by activists. I mean, we were both sitting here pretty stunned, frankly. This is supposed to be a press conference with a room of journalists. Those were activists who were interrupting the Secretary of State when he initially was thanking the press and talking about the Israeli-Hamas deal.
Yeah, I think it's really surprising. A lot of our viewers will have seen protests on Capitol Hill, for example, during confirmation hearings, but it's very rare for something like that to happen at the State Department. I'm over there all the time in that briefing room, and you need to have a reason to be at the State Department. You need to have an appointment. You need to have press accreditation to come and go. So it's unclear who those people were. So I think there's a real security question there. Allow me to be cheesy for a moment. This is a testament to American democracy and the way that American administrations approach their press rooms. They give accreditation to a wide number of journalists and increasingly what I would call less mainstream journalists, more opinion journalists, who have the opportunity to go to the State Department, to go to the White House, and to ask questions of the representatives of that administration. So I'm always amazed by whenever I go to these different press rooms about who's actually sitting there. It's not just Americans, it's people from all over the world, from Turkey, from China, from South Korea, who get to ask questions of people like Matt Miller at the State Department or Karine Jean-Pierre at the White House. And so there's a relatively open policy for now in these different press rooms.
Well, that's part of what I want to ask, because it was so heartening to see the reach of the clips from this press conference. On the other hand, there was this predictable, somewhat demoralizing response from the mainstream press. CNN headline was Blinken's final press conference interrupted by protesters. There was this persistent desire to frame you as something other than journalists, because obviously journalists hauled out of press conference doesn't quite give the democracy vibes that the mainstream press pretends to care about. There was this clip, we won't play it again for you, but we'll insert it here, of a couple of talking heads on, I believe, also CNN, being incredibly dismissive, referring to you as hecklers and saying they don't quite know who you are. So obviously there was this attempt to downplay what actually happened. But I think what's more powerful is the reality that they could not ignore it. It had to be covered. And for anyone who is at all intellectually curious about what happened, they had ample opportunities to get exposed to what actually happened in the room. And I do think, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, it got out there, but if MSNBC reported it, I don't know about it. If Fox News reported it, I don't know about it. I'm just saying that a lot of outlets that you'd think would have reported on it didn't, right? I mean, the Times, New York Times did something. Yeah. But it's remarkable that MSNBC wouldn't cover this, as far as I know. Fox News wouldn't cover this, as far as I'm concerned. So they are trying to limit the reach of it, and CNN is trying to dismiss it and look down their nose at it as if what they're, the partisan flackery that they do is authentic journalism, and they pretend that they don't know Max Blumenthal's name. They pretend they don't know Sam Husseini's name because they want to lock in their audience and don't want that their audience doing an internet search on our names. They don't want their audience to do an internet search on the Gray Zone or, God forbid, find my Substack. So, they want to dismiss it and they want to block it out because, a lot of people aren't online or don't have the time to dig up clips as much as we got a lot of reach on the internet, but that's still not necessarily, misses a lot of people. So their job is to not convey the murderous nature of U.S. policy and to not have people really think about what real journalism is.
Yeah, no, Sam, I agree with you entirely. But I think the reality is that fewer and fewer people are consuming their content on CNN or MSNBC. Totally. And so there's this interesting shift that's happening where some of the mainstream news programs successfully blacklisted you. Of course they did. Others seem to be compelled to cover it, even if they covered it in a dismissive way, which is not always the case, right? There is frequently the case that there's complete blackouts and all kinds of protests and all kinds of actions that happen. And then third, that despite those efforts to either dismiss or completely black out any and all coverage, the reality of increasing numbers of media consumers getting their media through untraditional means is exactly why you have your random doctor or national leaders, Max, contacting you, or Jesse Jackson knowing about it and contacting you and reaching out. And why, frankly, we're recording this in the wake of a TikTok ban, because I think there's a real clarity among people who are used to controlling levers of media about the lack of control when it comes to independent media or independent platforms like TikTok. But I want to come back to the sort of substantive issue here for a second. So much of the content that we've been getting out of these press briefings has been a push and pull around the genuine incentives of the Biden administration to fight for a ceasefire. In the media rigmarole, the game that's been played for over a year now, are these sort of representations that the Democratic Party, that Joe Biden is quote unquote working tirelessly for a ceasefire, that they're doing their level best, but that for whatever reason, usually pinned on Hamas, a ceasefire cannot be effectuated. Just recently, of course, we have this news that reportedly, I think it was the Washington Post, came out and said that a diplomat briefed on the ceasefire negotiations credited the influence of the Trump team, saying it was, quote, the first time there has been real pressure on the Israeli side to accept a deal, which is a stunning indictment of what the Biden administration and their press flacks have been representing to the public. And it did seem to inform, Sam, some of your questioning as well, especially that list of questions that you posted after the conference on your Twitter. What do you? I would love to get both of you to weigh in on how the Biden administration is trying to thread this needle of claiming credit for this ceasefire while they have manifestly been operating very openly to derail it, whether it's the UN vetoes, the rejection of international law, etc.
Yeah. There are a couple of levels here. One level is we know that Biden and Blinken tried to continue this war, this genocide, for as long as possible. I'm very concerned about what's going on now in terms of, Trump coming in and the machinations here. And if this is going to be a genuine ceasefire, or this is just the next stage of a series of diabolical plans, basically. They just recently got Salam, the president of the International Court of Justice, to step down and become Prime Minister of Lebanon. That's a bad sign for me. There are a whole series of bad signs for me. And let me take a little bit of issue with part of what Max said when he was talking to Blinken. He said, we all knew we had a deal back in May. I didn't think we had a deal back in May, because I felt like what really happened was the South Africa genocide case produced a series of orders from the ICJ, the International Court of Justice. And the final order was on May 24th. And it was the most direct order. It didn't just say, as the previous ones had said, you have to stop all genocidal activity. It said directly, you started attacking Rafah, you must stop your attack, you must not invade Rafah. Very direct. And the Algerians produced a draft resolution for the UN Security Council to implement that order. The US stalled that for a couple of days, and then on May 31st, a week later, Biden comes up and says, Israel has put forward this ceasefire proposal, hooray, hurrah, and they got the Algerians to put aside their resolution, which is how international law should work, and they got everybody on the Security Council to vote for a phony baloney resolution saying we bless this ceasefire effort brokered by the U.S. and Qatar. The Russians called it out, actually, but they didn't veto it. They just abstained. Everybody else voted for it. So it was apparent to me that the whole thing was farcical, and that they were lulling people into saying, we're working on a ceasefire, trust us. We're really, a lot of people didn't buy it. Some people didn't buy it. But the machinations around how it sabotaged the South Africa case it was apparent to me what the intent was. And the recent moves, as I say, with the president of the ICJ resigning and the interim president being brought in, who was one of the few who totally voted for Israel. So this signals to me that they are playing more and more diabolical games. And, throughout all of the shouting at, between Team Biden and Team Blinken and Trump and Netanyahu and so on, I think that they are beneath the surface cooperating. People often talk about, politics is professional wrestling. I think that it largely is they do a level of theater and then they collude behind the scenes. We see that.
Help me understand this cooperation. I mean, and I want you to come in here too, Max, and respond to Sam's kind of pushback against your characterization of the ceasefire. You think that despite Donald Trump claiming credit for the ceasefire, getting credit for the ceasefire, and Biden seemingly bristling at that reality, that they are working behind the scenes together toward what you think is a temporary, just ephemeral ceasefire for optics? For what purpose? Like, what's the narrative you think is actually going on here?
Well, they're getting the captives. Israel's getting the captives. It reminds me of Iraq in 1991. Saddam Hussein released all of the captives that they had. Iqbal Ahmed, the Pakistani scholar at the time, radical left, said this was an act of insane generosity. And within 2 weeks, they were bombing Iraq's infrastructure. So obviously, Gaza's infrastructure has been decimated, and a lot of people are celebrating this apparent ceasefire. I pray to God that they're right, but I am very concerned that there is a longer, more diabolical plan beneath the surface here. That there is absolutely no moral limit on what Trump and Blinken and Netanyahu will do. I mean, there was a complete pass-off between the Trump administration and the Biden administration. Blinken, in his hearings to be approved as Secretary of State, lauded the so-called normalization effort of the Abraham Accord and so on. And they are totally on the same page. Now they want normalization with Saudi Arabia. And they're all talking up a so-called two-state solution, which will be a perfunctory Palestinian state that they'll continue to whittle away. So the underlying structure is more one of insidious cooperation, in my view. I'd love to hear Max's thoughts.
Well, I agree with Sam. I agree with your analysis of why the ceasefire was put forward by the U.S. But what I was saying was the terms that were accepted just now were virtually the same as those put forward in May.
And that you're absolutely right, Max. Yes.
And aside from the Russians who knew what the game was, the insidious game was, but still accepted it because they understood how destabilizing and destructive continuation of the war would be, another group surprisingly accepted it. That was Hamas. And this was the organization that Blinken and his team consistently blamed to the very end for obstructing and preventing the ceasefire that they so desperately wanted in order to cover for the insidious game that Sam correctly says they've been playing all along. And the objective of the game, as Sam pointed out, is to ultimately consolidate the regional domination of the U.S. and the Gulf monarchies the retrograde Gulf monarchies and to put the Palestinian struggle in the historic icebox and then begin encircling and destroying Iran and whatever is left of the resistance axis. And so they were embracing the same program that Condoleezza Rice put on the table when she called the Israeli assault on southern Lebanon and southern Beirut in 2006 the birth pangs of a new Middle East, or which Netanyahu proclaimed when he visited the U.S. Capitol a second time and showed maps of the Middle East that Israel wants to bring into being by wiping out, all resistance, or what he calls terrorism. That's why. So Sam's right. The ceasefire was actually introduced by the U.S. to subvert international law, to subvert the ICJ decision. And then they proceeded to work forward to obstruct it while pantomiming support for it and pretending to pressure Israel, partly also to propel initially Biden, but then Kamala Harris forward as the nominee when the Democratic base was in open revolt against the policy, but also to give cover to Israel militarily as it used massive amounts of force, all thanks to U.S. weaponry, entirely thanks to U.S. munitions, to do as much damage as possible to Hezbollah in Lebanon. The U.S. definitely was involved in the al-Qaeda HTS offensive in Syria, which they've celebrated, to destroy as much of Gaza as possible in lieu of being able to actually damage Hamas militarily, and also to assault Yemen. The Biden Blinken gang started the war on Yemen all over again. And if you read closely the coverage throughout these months, these critical months, particularly after the very unusual incident in Majd al-Shams and the occupied Golan Heights, when Israel claimed that Hezbollah killed 12 Syrian children living in Israeli territory. Very unusual incident, which enabled Israel to begin unleashing its full military might on Lebanon, assassinating Nasrallah and many Hezbollah leaders. The Biden administration, and specifically the NSC, Tony led of Brett McGurk and Jake Sullivan, but also Tony Blinken and Amos Hochstein, who was an American, former Israeli military veteran who was made the U.S. envoy to Lebanon. They loved what they were seeing, and this actually led them deeper into supporting Netanyahu's policy. And Matt Miller said this openly at his final briefing. And what he said also that was interesting was that the killing of Yahya Sinwar, who was the Hamas leader, like Secretary General of Hamas, or Prime Minister of the Gaza Strip, and who the mastermind of the October 7th operation, which was designed to engineer a deal that would have relaxed the siege on Gaza and alleviated the suffering of Palestinian hostages in Israeli jails. When he was killed in the field with his men, unlike Netanyahu, who was in a bunker or whose plane was being escorted by an F-35 out of fear, when he was killed, the Biden administration openly acknowledged that it became that much more difficult, if not impossible, to get a deal because the deal had to be approved by those close to the resistance in Gaza. It couldn't be approved from Doha by Hamas's exiled leadership. So they actually killed the man who had the U.S. and the Biden administration endorsed the killing of Sinwar, of course. So did Kamala on the campaign trail. That that postponed the deal even further by design. And remember, Israel killed all previous negotiators. Salah Arori, who was the founder of Hamas in the West Bank, was in Beirut in his office when he was assassinated. He was the previous lead negotiator. And after that, it killed Ismail Haniyeh in Iran in order to provoke a regional war with Iran. So all along, the Biden administration was behind this policy of expanding the war in order to shift regional dynamics and get to the ultimate goal of the Abraham Accords, regional integration that would lead to the disintegration of the Palestinian struggle and the resistance axis that supported it. And that remains a key goal of the Trump administration, which actually brought into being the Abraham Accords with Jared Kushner as the point man. So everything Sam said is correct. And, I can go through the details of the ceasefire, and so can Sam, the ceasefire deal that was agreed on, and explain why it may actually disintegrate.
I would very much like you to do that. Just before, I just want to pick up on this aspect of Sam's point, where I'm confused by the why now of it all. The history of the last year plus that you've laid out seems very familiar and true, but the choice to even if it's ephemeral, even if it's short-lived, the choice to allow this media cycle in which it's being reported that Donald Trump, unlike Joe Biden, has been willing to put some pressure on to force a ceasefire.
It makes Trump look good. It makes Trump look powerful.
It makes Trump look great. What benefit does Biden have in not wanting to do this at a time that was more politically advantageous for him, seeing how it's quite obvious now, we could get into this a little bit if we'd like, that it was a significant, if not determinative factor in him losing the election on the basis of this new poll that's out that shows that 29%, the highest percentage of all of those folks who voted for Biden in 2020, but who did not vote for Joe Biden in 2024, did so because of Palestine.
I don't view U.S. politicians as necessarily acting in their own immediate self-interest as the most important thing. They view themselves as part of a larger enterprise that I view as an imperial enterprise, and that is their master. The system has been very generous to Joe Biden. And now what's needed for the system to operate is for Trump to look powerful, and then he will look reasonable if and when he decides that Israel is totally in its right to really go after Hamas and Gaza and the Palestinians and the West Bank and God knows what else. So it makes sense if you look at this through the lens of this is an empire and it has what are essentially tentacles that produce this theater. I'd like we can go ahead on that, but before we lose this thread, I'd like to just touch on what I think is the solution to a lot of this. What the South Africa lawsuit and the International Court of Justice things and the U.S. impeding things at the UN Security Council should bring things to the General Assembly. And the General Assembly, with a 2/3 majority, can invoke what's called the Uniting for Peace process. It's what the General Assembly used to go after South Africa in its occupation of Namibia, and it's what the General Assembly used against Israel, Britain, and France when they together invaded Gaza and the Sinai after Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal in 1956. A lot of the countries rhetorically are for that, but they haven't done it. So what needs to happen is, like, South Africa stepped up. South Africa called it a genocide, and then they made the next step. They invoked the Genocide Convention. You got a lot of countries calling this a genocide, but they are not taking the next step of invoking Uniting for Peace, and that would, could have a resolution with teeth, as was done in the case of South Africa. Sanctions, a peacekeeping force, arms embargo, suspending Israel from the UN. All of these things could be done. So in a matter, the part of the problem is organizing the forces, quote unquote, for good, in addition to opposing the forces for bad.
Max, I want to give you a chance to respond, because I'm still wrestling with the how should we perceive what's happened. So much of the discourse, obviously leading up to the election, folks like Mehdi Hassan, for example, were very antagonistic toward members of the Muslim community in particular and Arab Americans who saw at minimum a negligible, indistinguishable difference between Biden and Trump on their Gaza policy, and some of whom thought that Trump would be better. There's this famous clip of Trump going, I think, Dearborn and shaking hands with what I think is a popular boxer or martial artist or something like that, who's from the community, and promising him that we're going to wrap this up, like that there's going to be some resolution in Gaza. And that clip and people who put faith in that clip were really dismissed. I don't mean to just put it solely on Mehdi Hassan, but he was one of the more prominent actors that I can think of, who were saying, this is misguided. Trump is going to be so much worse for Palestine. Now, with the caveat that this, I take all of your cautionary words about this being temporary and being theater. And we should also play a clip of Netanyahu being very clear about this being temporary as well. That being said, in a year and a half of nothing happening, even a short respite does feel like a victory of sorts, combined with the reporting that I just read from the Washington Post that this is the first time that any pressure has been put on Israel to do anything at all, even to have a temporary ceasefire. I'm curious as to what your take would be if someone asked you, well, should I credit Trump for this? Is this a good thing? Should we be wagging our fingers at Palestinian Americans, Arab Americans who are celebrating, saying not so fast? Is this a net good? And also, do you think, similar as to what Sam said, that Biden is less invested in his own sort of legacy and is happy to let Donald Trump get credit? I'm kind of, that doesn't quite gel for me, given the way that Biden seems to be openly perturbed by the idea that he shouldn't get credit for the ceasefire.
Well, there's no question that the ceasefire took place now because Trump was coming into office. I don't know if it would have taken place if Kamala was coming into office, if the Biden administration would have finally put the squeeze on. But Netanyahu learned over the last 15 months, and especially over the last 8 months or so, that he could get away with anything he wanted, and the Biden administration would either quietly give him the attaboy and a pat on the back, or Biden, if he was disappointed or upset, would just leak some comments about how Netanyahu is an asshole to the New York Times, but would never say anything to show any daylight with Israel in public. And they definitely wouldn't do what they could have done, which was the whole point of my humanitarian intervention at Tony Blinken's last presser, one phone call to end the whole thing and force the ceasefire. We always said this would end with one phone call, and Trump and his envoy, Steve Witkoff, showed that. Just all you do is bend Netanyahu over the table and threaten him to kick him in the balls. In other words, threaten to suspend weapons, threaten to attack him in public. I mean, Trump is much more popular with his own base and carries sway that Biden didn't. So even if Trump's base is pro-Israel or anti-Muslim or anti-Arab, it doesn't matter because they trust Trump's word. Trump is unpredictable. He, it wasn't someone Netanyahu wanted to go to loggerheads with, at least at this point. And also Netanyahu wanted to give Trump the win. So that's another factor here. Netanyahu didn't want to give Biden the win. And then we have to consider Biden and his own legacy. Joe Biden is someone who went on the Senate floor in 1986 and said, if Israel didn't exist, we'd have to invent it. It's the best, $3.5 billion we spend every year is on Israel. He identified himself as a Christian Zionist when he speaks before AIPAC. And in some of the final meetings he had as president, he was welcoming the Israeli president, Isaac Herzog, and other Israeli officials to take photos to show that, he gave Israel whatever it wanted, and this is what he wanted his legacy to be. He didn't actually want his legacy to be stopping this genocide. He wanted it to be supporting Israel because that's who Joe Biden is. So there are all these personal factors. Steve Witkoff, who is he? He's not someone who comes from the national security or State Department bureaucracy. He's Trump's golf buddy. And he just wanted to give Trump the win. That's, he wasn't bringing the same kind of agenda that Jared Kushner brings to the table. So there's no question that Trump was seminal here, and that Trump being unpredictable can actually produce some very positive diplomatic exchanges, as he did on the Korean Peninsula, following the lead of one of the greatest diplomats in U.S. history, Dennis Rodman, to actually walk across the DMV and meet with Kim Jong-un, the North Korean leader, and try to bring peace that has been elusive for over 80 years, for over 70 years, to Koreans in the South who yearn for that. No other American leader, especially a Democrat, wouldn't do that, and he just got attacked mercilessly. So there is a side of Trump that clowns like Mehdi Hasan would not acknowledge, because they have their own personal opportunistic careerist agendas. It's not, and they're just not being objective. And I think you could see them being rejected by Muslim Americans, and especially by Arab Americans, who just came to a point where they said, we don't care, if Trump's like buffoon, or he said racist things about Palestinians. We just want this to end. We just want the killing to end. So we're willing to take a chance. It's really the fault of the Democrats that Trump is able to make that argument. And he's made that argument not just to Arab Americans and Muslim Americans. He makes it to Black Americans. He said that in 2016. He said, for all these years, the Democrats have kept you on their plantation and promised you all of these things. And what are you getting? How are your cities doing? How is Black America doing? And he would say, this was his line, he would say, what do you have to lose by voting for me? And he managed to slowly chip away at the Democratic control over Black America. So it's all the fault of the Democrats here. And this was a Democratic genocide. It was a Biden genocide. Whatever comes next, Trump is going to own it. And I expect the West Bank to be real scene of horrors in the months to come. I'm not thinking that Trump is going to exert serious leverage that'll weaken Greater Israel, but we have to be objective.
I want to get to the finer points of what this ceasefire deal actually is. Before we do, I hate to belabor this point, but I'm me. I want to play this clip. I just put it in Armand, of Joe Biden responding to a question about who should take credit for the ceasefire deal. Because this is the puzzle piece, I'm sorry, that I find to be a little bit dissonant still, is why are we getting this kind of reaction if this is a kind of grand two-party scheme to allow Donald Trump to sort of take credit for this? Let's take a look.
Will hold. I'm confident. Thank you.
Folks, credit for this, Mr. President, you or Trump?
Is that a joke? Oh, thank you.
Well, that clearly wasn't a joke, and that was Biden's parting words there after.
Now he seems upset, a little miffed at the idea that Donald Trump should get credit for the ceasefire. You've seen a lot of Democratic acolytes. I think I saw Simone Sanders, former press secretary for Joe Biden, saying, Biden is still president. Why is Donald Trump getting credit for this? And you've seen that, broader than just her. So does that not strike you as somehow dissonant, that there's a competition here, that that people are at odds, that there's something going on here that is something other than a straightforward shell game or theater, as you put it, Sam?
I do think that's theater. Of course, they're going to pretend that they're in opposition to each other. The Democratic and Republican parties all claim to be for the working man and all of this stuff, and then they both get money from Wall Street. They're both aligned to different tentacles of big tech. They're both aligned to different tentacles of the military-industrial complex, sometimes the same tentacles. And they present themselves in different ways to the American public so that the American public thinks that they have some choices. And I'm not saying that they're identical. I'm saying that they're like stages of a rocket.
I get that argument, Sam. And I get that argument even in this context. I don't have any doubt that the kind of foreign policy goals of the two corporate parties are identical. But I feel like, I mean, I don't want to belabor the point because obviously neither of you seem to really be agreeing with me. But there seems to be something like the value, like if there was a consensus that you can have a temporary ceasefire, not a permanent ceasefire. Obviously, there was a temporary ceasefire around the holiday times last year as well. This is not the first time that it's happened. But if you can kind of get a political boost from having a temporary ceasefire, knowing that it doesn't actually threaten your long-term project, the question of why there seems to be both sides wanting to take credit for one that's timed to benefit Trump, while there was absolutely no appetite to have one that was timed to benefit Biden and might have ultimately enabled him to win this election, strikes me as odd.
If he got a ceasefire prior to the election.
Yes, if there had been a more credible pantomime about quote unquote working tirelessly for a ceasefire, because they had managed to do this in, let's say, mid-October, stretching through the election, instead of now stretching through just long enough to get Donald Trump looking like a good guy.
Well, a couple of points. One, I think that sort of dovetails with Max's argument that he wanted, that Netanyahu wanted to give Trump the win. But
just to stay with that for a second, isn't that a little bit in conflict with us saying that at the end of the day, Biden, whatever American president, Reagan, can pick up a phone and end it, regardless of Netanyahu's kind of sympathy for Trump versus Biden? If we do believe that an American president, because the bombing is contingent on American resources, can stop this with a phone call, it's kind of irrelevant, no?
Well, what's going to happen to Biden if he pushes?
Mm-hmm.
What are the ramifications going to be for him? How will media coverage of his presidency differ? If you really have a knockout, drag-out fight. I mean, even, George Bush the first, when he started calling out AIPAC back in after the Gulf War, he got clobbered pretty bad by the rest of the U.S. establishment. And he wasn't trying to stop an Israeli genocide. He was just simply, sparring somewhat with the Israel lobby, and his approval, plummeted. So I think that that's at least a factor. You also said something really interesting. You said on the holidays, a lot of this stuff has been timed ultimately to manipulate the American mind. There were the first Gaza ceasefire pause, whatever, happened right before Thanksgiving, and then Biden announced the Lebanon so-called ceasefire, which Israel has repeatedly violated right before Thanksgiving. I argue that there is a massive apparatus to manipulate the American mind. They don't want the discussion around the Thanksgiving table to coalesce around what the hell is Israel doing? What the hell is the U.S. government doing in supporting this? They want the Thanksgiving Day table to be, wow, that's great. There's a ceasefire. How's Aunt Becky doing? I think that there is a massive apparatus to manipulate the public mind.
Yeah, I think that's right. Max, did you have anything else to add on this point?
No, I mean, just quickly, just on the messaging. I mean, Biden went off message there. He's very petty. He's not a very good politician. And at the State Department, the message that was emphasized when they were asked, isn't Trump really responsible for the ceasefire, was no, this was a bipartisan cooperation. So in many ways, they were acknowledging what Sam is, the point Sam is making.
It just feels so crazy to me that there would be a willingness to have, like, if it is true that the long-term goal of their, of normalization and the Abrams Accords and decimating the West Bank and all of these things are shared, the only value of a ceasefire is to give an optics win. A temporary ceasefire is to give an optics win to Trump. And it is, I still don't understand why Democrats would participate in that. I can understand why Trump would be able to make it happen. but why Democrats would be able to participate in it. And so I could see a rationale that says Trump wanted this for his own optics. Democrats can't be perceived as opposing a ceasefire, or it exposes them as having never been tirelessly fighting for it in the first place. And so they have to sort of start to try to frame it as a bipartisan effort. But that's why you get this frostiness from Joe Biden, because he would rather it not have happened to begin with. But Donald Trump sort of forced their hand. Like, to me, that's how I'm sort of trying to make, that's how it sort of makes sense to me. But that feels different from them, like, both kind of happily agreeing to give Donald Trump this win.
Yeah, I think it would be boring if they both happily agreed to give Trump this win in toto. You know, you need the theater of the politics of this, you know, of this disagreement, because it keeps everybody sort of confined to that space, in my view. I mean, we talked about Mehdi Hassan, and you know, it's the compulsion of the system. The key is to keep the duopoly in place. You know, this entire discussion sort of helps keep that duopoly in place. You know, did Trump make a win here? Did Biden make a win here? I think it's very ultimately functional long term for the establishment.
I want to read a paragraph from Anel. She's been on the show. She was one of these people who left, the State Department over the handling of Gaza. She wrote this in Responsible Statecraft about the ceasefire. The question that now remains is how long the ceasefire will last. The terms stipulate a 6-week cessation in fighting and an exchange of hostages by both sides, primarily 33 hostages held by Hamas over 42 days in exchange for approximately 1,000 Palestinian prisoners. Speculation on social media and after Biden's remarks was rife about how long the deal is likely to last. After boasting that he achieved his goal of a ceasefire by his inauguration, Trump may lose interest in reining in Israel's military operations in Gaza. The deal may last through the first phase of 42 days, but beyond that, the Israeli press has reported that Netanyahu promised Smotrich that the fighting would resume. I want to follow that up with a clip of Netanyahu speaking to this exact point, and then I want to get you both to respond to what your projections are for the course of this ceasefire. I'll start with you, Max, but let's watch this clip first.
Since he was elected, Trump was completely committed to the release of the hostages. We spoke on Wednesday. He congratulated me on the agreement, and he emphasized, and rightly so, that the first stage is a temporary ceasefire. This is what he said, a temporary ceasefire. Towards the next stages of the agreement, we are holding on to some significant assets so that we can bring back all of the hostages, and in order to accomplish all the goals of the war. Both President Trump and President Biden have provided full backing to Israel's right to resume fighting, to resume combat, if Israel reaches the conclusion that the negotiations over the second stage are pointless. I truly appreciate that. I also appreciate the decision of President Trump to lift all the remaining restrictions on the providing of essential munitions and weapons to the State of Israel. If we need to resume combat, we will do so in new ways, and we will do so with tremendous force.
All right, I'll start with you, Max. What do you make of that? Your projections on the kind of durability of the ceasefire?
Netanyahu's he needs to be taken at his word, although he's one of the most mendacious political leaders in human history, just as he should have been taken at his word back in October 2023 when he used genocidal rhetoric about Amalek. He is insisting, and this is I think the key insistence of Netanyahu is on an Israeli military presence in the Philadelphia corridor. He probably will insist on one. I don't know what they're going to do in the Netzarim corridor, which they've established between northern Gaza and the rest of the Gaza Strip, where they had built this de facto military base across the Gaza Strip to cut off the north from the rest of Gaza. And there were plans that to essentially ethnically cleanse the north and annex it. The religious nationalist movement, which is incipient, increasingly dominant in Israel, that's kind of been held off by the ceasefire, but it's really this Philadelphia corridor that's the main sticking point in phase 2. And that is because that is the area between the Egyptian Sinai, which has lots of smuggling networks. There are still active tunnels there between Egypt and Gaza, and all kinds of goods come through there, including weapons. And what Israel's main objective is to prevent Hamas from reconstituting itself as a military fighting force. They failed in Netanyahu's key goal of eradicating Hamas. That's clear from the scenes we see today in Gaza City, where the Nukba, de facto special forces of Hamas's Al-Qassam brigades, are out in the streets. And they failed in getting the hostages or captives out through military force. They had to negotiate with Hamas. But now, after October 7th, the whole Israeli public seems to be united on supporting some form of military occupation on a permanent basis of parts of the Gaza Strip. And the deal calls for them to leave the Philadelphia corridor. So that's where I think the deal may start to fall apart. And if there's an Israeli military presence inside Gaza, well, they're sitting ducks, they're targets for hit and run attacks, just as they were targets before the Israeli disengagement in 2006, which was about disengaging militarily and led Israel into using massive air power and drones and its navy in place of a presence inside. But Netanyahu's saying there has to be a presence inside the Gaza Strip. We've also seen Greater Israel expand massively, or expand in unexpected ways in recent months. Now Israeli troops are inside the Syrian Golan Heights. They're setting up checkpoints. They've seized 40% of Syria's water. They're even arresting Syrian citizens. And they're doing this without any resistance because of the regime change operation, culminating with the takeover of Damascus by the rebrand of Al-Qaeda, backed by NATO, backed by Qatar, and effectively backed by the US and UK. So Israel, by expanding its reach into all these other areas, is also making itself vulnerable in new ways going forward. And I think there are material factors that exist independent of all the political jousting in the US and apart from US diplomacy that also forced this ceasefire. And one of them is the weakening of the Israeli military's infantry brigades, the Golani Brigade, for example, and the reservists. The reservist corps is heavily depleted in Israel. It depends on men who are in, their mid-20s all the way into up to like 40 years old. And some of them have had seen 3 deployments to Gaza. Many of them have been injured, suffered heavy, like crippling injuries, demoralized, psychologically traumatized. And it's been reported by everyone from Israel's Channel 12 to Arabic language media that a lot of these units are no longer functioning because men are not showing up anymore. So for Netanyahu to go back into Gaza, it's going to have to be with the professional battalions and more like Israeli special forces. It's going to be harder to reinforce them. Israel's going to be focused more on the West Bank and on the near abroad, as well as a possible attack on his Iranian nuclear facilities. And it's going to be heavily dependent on air power, U.S. supplied air power to do any of it, which means U.S. approval, U.S. green light for everything.
I mean, one of the things he mentioned in that clip was lifting whatever restrictions on U.S. aid to Israel. I'm curious what those restrictions even are, because it seemed like Biden, with the exception of that one moment where he said he was going to restrict the 2,000-pound bombs, it's been a carte blanche, blank check relationship for the past almost year and a half. Is that the kind of thing that you're alluding to?
There was a pause on 2,000-pound GBU bombs to Israel that I think was actually lifted in the Biden administration. There were
Yeah, that's my
complaints by
memory,
Israel
too.
about the slow walking of certain weapons systems. But when we saw Israel enter Lebanon and, for example, to kill Hassan Nasrallah, they were using 2,000-pound and maybe even 5,000-pound bunker busters. They had decimated 7 apartment blocks to get to him. That was the result of the U.S. oversupplying Israel. And we even heard at the State Department, Matthew Miller, whenever he was challenged about the air bridge that had been set up between U.S. weapons manufacturing plants and the Nevatim air base in Israel, where they were then just like shipped out onto they were then just like dropped on top of families' heads in Gaza. He would always say, well, they need these bombs because they are going to have to fight Hezbollah. So I don't know what difference it's going to make to lift any restrictions on arms to Israel. It just seems like a political game to me. And I got to jump off now.
Yeah, look, I really appreciate you spending the time with us today, Max. I know you both have been busy, and obviously everybody and their mom wants to talk to you, pick your brain about this stuff because
they don't. I mean, no one's mom wants to talk to me, but also mainstream media never interviewed us about what happened after refusing to name us. And I mean, I would have thought Sam at least would have been interviewed because he was physically roughed up by police who had been sicked on him under the orders of the press secretary, Matthew Miller, who was running around like Bartok serving Rasputin. So I would have thought that would have been newsworthy, but no, Sam, not one mainstream organization interviewed you, did they?
No, I mean, the Times and some other places wrote it up and mentioned me and I think you and so on, but no one said, let's do an interview. Let's hear your side of the story. Let's get some background from you. Nothing like that. I thought Max's breakdown there was fabulous. The only thing that I'd add, which has sort of been sitting in my craw, is Blinken's statement recently saying Hamas has more fighters now.
Each time Israel completes its military operations and pulls back, Hamas militants regroup and reemerge because there's nothing else to fill the void. Indeed, we assess that Hamas has recruited almost as many new militants as it has lost. That is a recipe for an enduring insurgency and perpetual war. The longer the war goes on, the worse the humanitarian situation gets in Gaza.
Yeah.
Which sounds like a defeat, but it kind of feeds into their genocidal mentality because there's more, Hamas fighters. So I guess we're going to have to kill a bunch more Palestinians.
Exterminate them. It feels like an exterminator's call to action.
How did they get those fighters? Well, they were teenagers and now they've grown up. And so we need to kill more teenagers to prevent them from growing up.
Right. The reasonable response is let's get to peace. But in their perverse twisting of it, I think that they're ultimately going to say, we got to kill these guys too now.
Yeah. Well, look, thank you again, both of you, for your time. I'll let you go. Max, where can people find you and your work on the internet and beyond?
The Gray Zone, thegrayzone.com. Follow us on YouTube, Rumble, Twitter. Everybody knows where to find me on the internet. And hopefully they don't know where to find me in real life.
From your lips to God's ears, I want that for us all. Sam, how about you? Where should people go to read more of your work?
The main thing is on my Substack, Husseini.substack.com. If you go to Husseini.org, it goes to a LinkedIn tree where you can see, me on other platforms as well. I spend way too much time on Twitter. Hopefully that'll be scaling back somewhat.
Another from your lips to God's ears resolution for 2025. I want that for me as well. Thanks to both of you. Thank you for your courage. Thank you for your credibility. Thank you for your intellect. Thank you for your investigative prowess. I cannot thank you enough. You're such a boon to this community. And thank you to all who watched this episode. You can get an additional episode of Bad Faith Podcast every week on Mondays at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. Please take care of yourselves, stay vigilant, and keep the faith. Hey, YouTube. Thanks for watching. Just a reminder that this is a podcast. You can catch an extra premium episode every Monday for $5 a month at patreon.com/badfaithpodcast. That's patreon.com/badfaithpodcast for $5 a month, an extra episode every week. Additionally, please do consider liking this video, subscribing to this channel. It helps us out. It helps independent media beat the algorithm. We appreciate you. And as always, keep the faith.